Who's running the zoo? Once upon a time, our friend Daniel from the Bible went to the zoo and it was a mess. Okay, not really. He had a couple crazy visions about wild animals going nuts, and it was still a mess though. We're going to look at the second vision he had, Daniel chapter 8, but first let's just think about what we're supposed to be looking for here rather than what we want to look for. Prophetic literature is normally repent and do this instead of what you're doing, and then this won't happen. This is apocalyptic literature, so it's a bit different. Daniel isn't really trying to get his readers to do anything. I'm sure there's lots of things he would love us to do, but that's not the point. He's trying to get us to see God's work. He's trying to get us to understand certain patterns that occur throughout history, and that there is suffering now and there's going to be even more suffering, but God is in control. And through this book, through this vision, God gives us a powerful reminder that he is the one in authority over all things. And he put all of us where we are so that we can work as his agents in bringing a bit of order into the chaos. So let's start off with the first couple verses in chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. So he had this vision during the reign of Belshazzar, who you can read about in Daniel chapter 5. He was an arrogant Babylonian ruler who defiled objects stolen from the temple of God. And then a big hand appeared and started writing on the wall, and he brought Daniel in to say, "What's up?" And Daniel said, "Oh, that says Babylon's going to fall and you're going to die." And then later that night, those things happened. So the vision happens before that event, but the way the book is structured, all Daniel's visions are at the end. So you get to chapter 8, you've already read about that, which means when he mentions Belshazzar, he wants us thinking about arrogant, doomed kings. When he has the vision where he was, that's in Persia. Persia is the empire that's going to come over and take over Babylon. So we're going to walk through this chapter. I'm going to jump us around a little bit because it's long. The first half is a bunch of symbols, and the second half is a bunch of explanation. So I'm going to read the first part of the symbol, and then we're going to get into the first part of the explanation. Just smaller chunks, easier to follow. So this is verses 3 through 8. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. This probably doesn't sound like something we see every day, even when we go to the petting zoo, but it's kind of a similar atmosphere to how I feel when I'm reading the news for a few minutes that turn into half an hour and get overwhelmed with just everything happening all at once. And there's actually a good reason for that. I've actually heard people in the last year or so say, it feels like a wild animal is running loose in Eastern Europe. And that's probably how Daniel would put it. Probably wild animals running loose in a lot of places. Gabriel's going to show up for the first time in the Bible in a second and explain a little bit of this. But before that, just a couple notes on what the first readers would have understood. Back in the day, animals were often used as symbols for nations. We do that now. Everyone's afraid of Canada because we have the ferocious and mighty beaver. We will come to you and we will bite your trees and make little houses out of your trees, and it's going to be cozy, and no one can stop us, which is probably the most nationalistic thing I've ever said. But so animals were expected to represent kingdoms. Horns were symbolic of power and kingship. So people would probably look at this and say, so one country is going to come in, mess up a bunch of other countries. Another one's going to come in, mess them up the exact same way. There's a lot of repetition in that for a reason, because this is a cycle that happens throughout history, really, if you look at the way nations treat each other. So Gabriel's going to show up in verse 15 through 22 and explain a few things. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice by the ulai calling, "Gabriel, help this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, "Understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end." As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia, the shaggy goat, the king of Greece. And the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power." So maybe that makes a little more sense now with this ram and the goat. First of all, I just want to make a quick note. When he talks about the time of the end, that's not necessarily the end of time. Not that these events don't show patterns that will eventually reach their peak, but he's talking about the end of this time of wrath. He's talking about time of domination and persecution by Gentile empires like Persia, like Greece. He's saying there's a light at the end of the tunnel. He's saying don't panic, which is often the opposite of what we think when we hear somebody say the time of the end, but that's what's going on here. The writing's metaphorically on the wall for Babylon at this point. Persia's going to come in and take over. It's not going to be literally on the wall until right before they take over, but Daniel knows what's coming from his previous vision. Turns out Persia has the exact same fate in store for it already, because God's the author of history. Greece is going to come in. This giant horn that the kingdom of Greece has is Alexander the Great, one of the most famous kings in history, one of the greatest military minds that the human race ever produced. The goat doesn't touch the ground because he conquers the whole known world in just a few years and then promptly dies around age 30 or so. He died of a fever, or as Daniel puts it, the large horn was broken off. I know that everybody is super excited about grammar, but just in case there are one or two people who aren't English teachers for some reason, that's what we call the passive voice. And before everybody's brain shuts down because I'm talking about grammar, all that means is if I say, "I was woken up today by my alarm," that's passive. If I say I woke up, that's not passive. So when Daniel says the horn was broken, he's implying it was broken by something, by someone, but what or who could possibly have the power and influence to break off the strongest king in history at the height of his power? God. When Daniel is using language like that, he's telling us there is a force at work in history, and that force is God, who has the authority over all things and has set limits to all things. He had power over Alexander the Great. He has authority over all the rulers and nations of the world today, even if they think they're in charge. So when Alexander died, his kingdom was split into four parts, like the four horns. One of those kingdoms, called the Seleucid dynasty, eventually produced a king who would conquer a bunch of territory and then persecute the Jews in Jerusalem. We're going to get a sense of how that's going to go here, going back to the first part of the vision, verses 9 through 14. Out of one of them, that's one of the four horns, came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens and threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." We have arrogance, persecution, At this point, we know that this horn is a king. He sounds a lot like that Belshazzar guy that Daniel mentioned earlier. 2300 evenings and mornings there is not meant to be a timeline for when the world is going to end, which I've seen some people take it as. Long story short, there are a few different opinions on what exactly that's counting down to, what exactly it's counting down from. That doesn't matter as much as we might think it does, because it's not pointing toward the end of the world. It's pointing toward this king who showed up at this time and persecuted the Jews. What this means is there's a limit. There's a hard limit to how far this guy can go. There is an appointed time that God has decided he's going to come in and save his people. What's interesting here is that we have an angel saying, "How long?" And how long is a phrase we hear a lot in the Bible. If you read the Psalms, you'll find a lot of lament. You'll find a lot of, "How long, O Lord? How long must I suffer this? How long will you be silent?" Sometimes in the Bible, you'll find God saying, "How long must I put up with this sinful generation?" Which is not something I want him to say to me. But the point is, usually it's more of a rhetorical statement than a real request for information, but then there's an answer. And we don't know always exactly what it means, but the answer is there's a limit. When we're crying out, there is a limit to how much God is going to make us endure. There's a limit to how much God is going to let people get away with. Now let's see what Gabriel has to say about this in verses 23 through 26. "In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation, and he will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future." Now, the distant future for Daniel isn't necessarily the distant future for us. Daniel wrote a long time ago. And again, we hear that little passive voice. He will be destroyed. It's not people who are going to do it. It's God who will do it. It's God who sets the limits for the rulers of this world. Now, in the 2nd century BC, there was a man named Antiochus IV. He conquered a lot of territory, he ruled over Jerusalem, and he really persecuted the Jews because he wanted everyone to worship Zeus. So he went into the temple. He defiled the temple by putting up an altar to Zeus. He sacrificed all sorts of unclean things. No one could use the temple anymore for quite some time. Anyone who disagreed with Antiochus got killed, obviously, because that's how kings work. This guy even called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which basically means Antiochus the god, which tells you something about his self-image. But as Daniel tells us, as history tells us, if we look at history, the more a ruler puffs himself up, makes himself big, the harder he falls. God took him out. Because God took him out sort of between the testaments, Christians often forget about this. It's in the Apocrypha, but Protestants don't really care about the Apocrypha. If you don't know what the Apocrypha is, that's a bunch of books that some churches think kind of half count for part of the Bible. And one of them does talk about resistance against Antiochus. But the Christian population of the world has mostly forgotten that. The Jewish people, on the other hand, remember this. This is where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from. It comes from people resisting Antiochus and remembering God providing for them as they resisted. This is literature about surviving in empire and resisting against it. And God sees his people through. Both Jews and Christians who have been persecuted over the years have sort of read their own experience into this passage. And they're not really wrong for reading the passage and seeing themselves in it, even if It's not specifically that one guy who's persecuting them. This is a pattern in history. It repeats itself in many ways. All nations are really wild animals running rampant, whether it's Greece and Persia, whether it's Russia, whether it's the British Empire in its heyday, whether it's us sometimes. Sometimes someone comes along who fits the image of this little horn all too well. Shortly after the resurrection of Jesus in the year 70 AD, Rome came along and attacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. The people saw that. The people saw that experience in Daniel chapter 8 and the rest of Daniel. Persecution of Christians by Rome that we hear about in history, that we read a little bit about in the New Testament, they would have seen that themselves in there. Throughout history, the Soviet Union carrying out possibly the biggest persecution of Christians in history in the 20th century, Christians saw themselves in Daniel. The biggest example of a tyrant in the modern mind and the biggest example of persecution of Jews in modern history was Hitler and Nazi Germany. People would have been pretty reasonable to see themselves in Daniel chapter 8 when they were suffering under Hitler. And for the Jewish people, they saw themselves as suffering under Christian persecution. They saw that as the culmination of centuries of Christian persecution, and they could see Christians as the little horn persecuting them. And that's something that, as the church, we have to repent for. We have to own our responsibility in some way for that. Just like as Canadians, we have to grapple with the graves we find at residential schools that remind us of how our own nation has been a wild animal at times and trampled under its feet whoever it could. This kind of violence appears again and again through history. And while Daniel chapter 8, or any given chapter, isn't strictly about the rise of the Antichrist, it is pointing to a pattern that will reach a peak at some point. There is something ultimate about this persecution, about this evil that keeps rearing its head. One day, Christians will probably look at Daniel chapter 8, other parts of Daniel, Revelation, a few other things, and they will see themselves in the final ultimate conflict. But we don't need to assume that's us. And we often do. We need to remember that chaos and persecution don't normally lead to the second coming. It hasn't yet. We don't need to assume that it will for us now. But when we suffer, when we look at the wars, multiple wars raging across the world, even though we often only think of one right now, when we look at runaway inflation, when we look at homelessness going out of control, when we look at climate change and pandemics, and we think, how long will we have to deal with this? Maybe Jesus will come and fix it soon. Maybe he will come and fix it in 100, 200, 1,000 years. But there's a limit that God has put on every suffering because God is the one in charge. So even if we aren't making charts, and we shouldn't be making charts to see when Jesus is coming back, but we should know that God is in control. We still have a verse left. So let's read the final verse. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got and went up. I went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. I'm worn out. I'm exhausted. With over 2,000 years between me and Daniel, we have a little more hindsight to look back on. It's a little easier for us to interpret the visions than it would have been for him in some ways. And also, we have mass media. We have our smartphones and we have news apps, and we can look at those and we can see all the wild animals raging around the world. And if anyone does have a bunch of different apps on their phone for news, do yourself a favor and turn off notifications for those. You'll remember to read the news. You don't need notifications every couple hours reminding you what you should be scared of, what you should be anxious about. Just for the record, God is in control, and also maybe turn off notifications on your news apps because you don't need that. And Daniel is worn out and exhausted and overwhelmed and overloaded. And he's pretty old by this point, so he's going to need some time to recover. But once he does, he gets up and goes back to work. He goes back to work in a workplace that doesn't recognize and is really set against God. He goes back to work for a government that he knows is immoral and that he knows is not long for this world. And after that, he's going to serve the Persians. I wouldn't say follow, but he's going to serve the Persians. He goes back to work even though his job is to work for these wild, chaotic animals who tear the world apart. And this is the kind of job where some people might look at that and say, Daniel, you're kind of propping up some really terrible, oppressive structures and systems here. And he's working within systems of oppression and violence. There's no doubt about that, and he knows it. But he's doing it with integrity. If you look at chapter 6, we see Daniel's doing his job as one of the people of God in this position. He's doing it with integrity, and everyone else hates him for it. And everyone else wants to kill him and take his job, which tells me that if anybody else was doing that job, Persia would have been a worse place. So even if the place we're in doesn't recognize God and props up all these immoral things that are against him, God put us in there and God can use us to carry out his will and impose order on this chaotic mess of a zoo. And there are probably very few jobs these days where we can say there's nothing questionable at all. Government comes to mind, but financial sector, tech sector, everything's so interconnected and everything is so dominated by greed and consumerism that it's enough to make people like me want to run away and not participate in societies and economies and live in the woods, which would be nice. But Daniel goes back to work because he knows that even though he's in an unjust place where he's looked down on because of his faith, where he probably can't talk about this vision he had because people would at best laugh at him and at worst try to kill him, God wants him there. And as hard as it is, God's going to use him. And we see God use him in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, except for the chapter he's not in. Then we see God use his friends. Daniel lives in the tension between how his society sees things and how God sees things. And that's not an easy tension. And he's troubled by it. But he lives in it and he faces it. And he does so with the knowledge that despite the fact that he's in the society and working in and working with it, and that he's doing God's will, God's the priority. But what are we supposed to take from this? History is a cycle of animals running loose and butting heads with each other. Any historian or political theorist will pretty much agree with that. But God can still work with these animals. God worked with the animal Babylon to take his people into exile when they've been unfaithful. God's going to work with the Empire Persia after this vision to bring his people back to Jerusalem, to restore the temple and restore the city. God has power and authority over all of this. God broke Alexander. God broke Antiochus when he was persecuting the Jews. God broke Hitler, and God's going to break whoever else comes and sets himself up against him. God has put us in places that don't praise him, that don't know him, because we are agents of God's will. God has authority and God is working in the chaotic world, and part of that work is us working to restore his order. So let's remember who's running this zoo, and let's get back to work.